So I want to kick off this deep dive with something that, well, I think it challenges a belief that most of us just, take for granted.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
If I were to ask you, or anyone listening,
Mm.
to name the one universal taboo, the one line that, pretty much every culture and society agrees you shouldn't cross,
Right.
what would you say?
Oh, well, it has to be incest.
Right.
That's the big one.
Exactly. That's what I would have said. It just feels hardwired, like a biological, nope.
Yeah.
We assume it's the one rule everybody, everywhere has always followed.
That's definitely the modern assumption. There's a very real evolutionary reason for that. That yuck factor is nature's way of screaming, don't go there, the genetic bill will come due.
Right. But here's the thing. I was digging through the research for this deep dive, and I found this study from a Rutgers anthropologist, and I hit a number that just, it stopped me cold.
Oh.
It says that throughout human history, 80%, 80 of all marriages have been incestuous. And they define that as being between second cousins or closer. 80%. Which means for most of our existence, keeping it in the family wasn't the weird exception, it was the norm.
That is a statistic that just completely flips everything on its head, doesn't it? But, we have to be super careful with the context there, or we risk getting the wrong idea about the past.
Okay, so break it down. What's the context?
Well, for most of human history, for your average person, let's say a peasant in a village in the 1200s, marrying a cousin wasn't really a choice. It was a math problem, a geography problem.
Because their whole world was just, what, a few square miles?
Exactly. Your dating pool was your village, maybe the next village over if you were lucky. If you live in a place with 200 people and you never travel more than, say, 5 miles from where you were born, guess what? Everyone is related to you in some way.
So you marry who's there. It's a necessity of isolation.
That's a necessity. It's about survival.
Yeah.
But that's the common person, and that is not what we're talking about today.
No. We're looking at the other end of the spectrum. The people who had all the options, the money, the power, the ability to marry anyone from any kingdom. And they chose to marry their own nieces and first cousins. Deliberately.
Precisely. That is the critical difference. For the peasant, it's an accident of geography. For the elite, and specifically for the dynasty we're profiling today, it was a weapon. It was a calculated multi-century strategy to seize power and, more importantly, to hoard it.
And we are talking about the absolute heavyweights of European history, the House of Habsburg.
Oh, yeah, the biggest.
And this isn't just a story about a weird family tree. This is the story of how one family basically conquered the world using marriage contracts as a tool of war.
Yeah.
And then they literally disintegrated from the inside out because they refused to let any new DNA into the system.
It is the ultimate cautionary tale, really. It's ambition versus biology. They thought they could outsmart nature to protect their real estate portfolio.
Yeah.
And nature destroyed them for their arrogance.
The scale of it is just, it's mind-boggling. We're talking about generations of madness, of genetic collapse, a dynasty that ruled for centuries while their heirs were either dying in the cradle or living in constant agonizing physical pain.
It has that Game of Thrones feel to it.
It really does.
Yeah.
But without the dragons.
Yeah.
Just the, incredibly uncomfortable family reunions and the backstabbing political schemes.
And just like in those epic stories, to really get why it ended so badly, you have to go back to the beginning. You can't understand why the Habsburgs became so obsessed with their own bloodline unless you understand the world they clawed their way out of.
Which takes us to our setting.
Yeah.
Because before they were in palaces, before the velvet and the crowns, the Habsburg story begins in a time and place that sounds terrifying. We need to go to the 14th century.
Yes. If you had a time machine and could choose any period in history to avoid, the 14th century should be right at the top of your list. It is, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, arguably the worst century in recorded human history.
Now, that's a bold claim. You're saying worse than the 20th century with 2 world wars. Worse than the fall of Rome.
In terms of the sheer, raw, existential misery for the average person living through it, yeah, probably. You have to grasp the psychological atmosphere. This wasn't just, oh, times are tough. This felt like the literal end of days. People genuinely believed the apocalypse was happening right outside their door.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Why was it so unbelievably bad? What was the trigger?
It was what some historians call a polycrisis. It wasn't one disaster. It was a cascade. a convergence of catastrophes. And it starts with the environment itself turning against them.
Right.
For centuries, Europe had been in what's called the medieval warm period. Basically, good weather, which meant good harvests, which meant the population could grow.
Yeah.
But around the early 1300s, the climate just flips. We plunge into the Little Ice Age.
So global cooling, not warming.
Aggressive cooling. We have chronicles describing snow falling in Italy during the summer for the first time in 500 years. The Baltic Sea froze solid. For farmers, this was a death sentence. The growing seasons were slashed by frost.
And if the crops fail?
Then you get famine. The Great Famine hit early in the century. We're talking maybe 10 to 15% of the urban population just starving to death. There are credible, horrifying reports of cannibalism in cities like London and Paris. People were eating grass, roots, their own children.
That's just unimaginable. So the entire population is starving, they're cold, they're weak, and that's when the biology hits them.
That's when the big one arrives. 1347, a ship from the Black Sea docks in Sicily, and with it comes the Black Death.
The plague.
The plague. And it is so hard for us in our modern world to wrap our heads around the scale of this. You know, we get anxious about pandemics that have a 1% mortality rate. The plague wiped out somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population of Europe in 7 years.
Stop and think about that math for a second. If you're at a dinner party with 4 people, a few years later, 2 of them are dead.
Gone. And the way they died was just, it was monstrous. These gangrenous swellings, the buboes, the size of apples in the groin and armpits, bleeding from the eyes, coughing up blood. Death was often less than 48 hours away. And because it moved so fast and was so deadly, the social contract completely dissolved.
What do you mean by that, the social contract?
I mean, the basic rules of being human evaporated. Priests refused to give the last rites because they were terrified of getting sick. Parents would literally abandon their sick children in their beds to try and save themselves.
Wow.
There were bodies piling up in the streets because there was no one left alive and strong enough to dig the graves. It was total nihilism, the end of everything.
It sounds like something out of a zombie movie, but it was real life.
It absolutely was. You can see it in the art from the period. This is when the dance macabre or dance of death genre explodes in popularity. You see all these paintings of skeletons dancing with kings, with bishops, with peasants.
Right. Death is the great equalizer.
The message was clear. Death is coming for every single one of us, and your fancy titles won't save you.
And I'm guessing on top of the freezing and the dying and the starving, the politics of the era were also a complete mess.
Total chaos. You've got the 100 Years' War between England and France, which is just chewing up the countryside. In Spain, the Reconquista is still dragging on. And the big power in the middle, the Holy Roman Empire, which is so central to our story, it wasn't a unified country like modern Germany.
No, it was more like a collection of states, right?
A messy, squabbling confederation of hundreds of little princes, bishops, dukes, and knights all stabbing each other in the back. So yeah, the society is freezing, starving, dying from an incomprehensible disease, and constantly at war. It's the absolute bottom.
But that kind of chaos, it creates a vacuum.
That is the key insight. As they say, chaos is a ladder. This massive die-off created an enormous power vacuum. The old, established, aristocratic families, the ones who had held land and titles for centuries, they were just wiped out. Their lines ended. Everyone was dead. Which meant, for the first time in a long time, there was room at the top for new players.
The survival of the richest.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe survival of the luckiest.
It was both. If you were lucky enough to survive the plague, and if you were ruthless enough to grab the land and titles that were suddenly up for grabs, you could rise very, very fast.
Right.
And stepping into this vacuum, climbing over the piles of bodies, is this scrappy, frankly shady family of minor landlords from Western Germany, the Habsburgs.
Let's talk about those humble beginnings.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I think Habsburg, I think of the palaces in Vienna, the Spanish Armada, the Jaw. I don't think scrappy. But they started out pretty rough, didn't they?
Oh, they were absolute nobodies on the European stage. It's funny, later on, once they were the most powerful family in the world, they hired these genealogists to cook up these glorious fake backstories.
Of course they did.
They claimed they were descended from Julius Caesar, or from Aeneas, the mythical founder of Rome. The usual propaganda.
It's a classic dictator move. I'm not just some guy I have divine mandate from history.
Exactly. But the real story was much, much grittier. Their founding figure, as far as we can trace, was a guy named Guntram the Rich, way back in the 10th century. And despite that nickname, he was not a benevolent philanthropist. The contemporary sources describe him as incredibly greedy and treacherous.
So what was his game? What made him so bad? Just a tough landlord.
He was a straight-up thug.
Yeah.
And an innovator in exploitation. He was one of the first in his region to systematically force free peasants into serfdom, which wasn't even the standard economic model there yet. He was ahead of the curve on oppression.
A trendsetter.
A trendsetter in misery. But he was also politically slippery. He betrayed the Holy Roman Emperor of his day, got caught, and was stripped of most of his lands. The family was almost snuffed out before it even began.
So how did they recover?
His heirs managed to cling to just enough territory to build a small castle in what is now Switzerland, and they called it Habsburg, which roughly translates to Hawk's Castle.
Hawk's Castle. It sounds formidable.
Well, don't picture a Disney castle with soaring spires. This was more like a multi-story defensive bunker with crooked windows. It was rough. It reflected their status at the time. They were broke, minor nobles clinging to a rock for dear life.
And there's a story from this early period, right? A legend about a curse. I love a good origin story curse.
It's a very, very telling legend, whether it's literally true or not. The story goes that an early Habsburg ancestor seduced a local craftsman's daughter. He promised he'd marry her, you know, the classic line. And then once she was pregnant, he completely ghosted her to marry a woman with a better dowry.
A tale as old as time.
But it gets much darker. She came to the castle to confront him, to demand he keep his promise. And instead of just turning her away, he had his guards grab her and throw her into a dungeon.
Oh my God.
And he just left her there. She starved to death in the dark. And as she was dying, she cursed the family. She proclaimed that heaven would avenge her, and that the family would one day be destroyed by their own blood.
That is some heavy stuff. But looking at how things turned out, the curse didn't exactly work immediately. They didn't just drop dead.
Yeah.
They got more powerful.
No, they didn't. And that's what makes the legend so eerie when you look back at it with hindsight. It's like the curse had a delay function. It didn't strike them down when they were nobodies in a crooked castle. It waited. It let them rise, let them conquer the world, let them become the absolute masters of Europe, and then it rotted them from the inside out.
It's almost a more cruel punishment that way. Let them get everything, just so losing it hurts more.
Precisely.
So how do they do it? How do you get from a crooked castle and a starvation dungeon to ruling the world? He said they didn't have a big army, they didn't have much money, they were minor players.
Yeah.
What was the strategy?
They figured out pretty early on that they couldn't win by force. They couldn't outfight the King of France. They couldn't outmuscle the rising Ottoman Empire, at least not in the beginning. So they chose a different path. Brains over brawn. Or, maybe more accurately, weddings over wars.
Right, this is where their famous motto comes from.
Yes. The strategy that eventually became immortalized in this Latin phrase, Bella geron ali, tu felix Austria nube.
Okay, my high school Latin is a little rusty. Break that down for us.
Yeah, let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry.
That is a brilliant branding slogan. Make love, not war, but for God's sake, get the real estate deed in the prenup.
That's basically it. The full sentiment is even more poetic. For the kingdoms which Mars gives to others, Venus gives to you. Mars, the god of war. Venus, the goddess of love and marriage. They essentially turned their family into an elite marriage agency. They hired for heiresses.
So if a duke died and only left a daughter,
The Habsburgs were there, bouquet in hand, ready to marry her and absorb her duchy into their growing portfolio of properties. It was like corporate mergers and acquisitions, but with wedding vows instead of shareholder meetings.
and the archetype for this whole strategy, the guy who really perfected it, was Rudolph I.
Rudolph I in the late 13th century. He's the one who really put them on the map. But I want to debunk the idea that happy Austria was all peaceful and loving. Rudolph was a ruthless pragmatist. He was not a peaceful man.
Give us an example. What kind of ruthless are we talking about?
Well, there's a story where a neighboring lord insulted him. Rudolph didn't challenge him to a duel or sue him. He just invaded the guy's lands, burned everything to the ground, and killed him personally. In another incident, he was feuding with the bishop, so he burned down a convent with the nuns still inside, just to get to him.
Okay, so Happy Austria was extremely violent when it needed to be.
Absolutely. But Rudolph was smart. He knew that violence alone wouldn't get him to the top. He used bribery, intimidation, political maneuvering, and, yes, a network of marriage alliances to get himself elected as the Holy Roman Emperor in 1273.
And that was the game changer.
That was the turning point. That election lifted the family from being minor counts to sitting on the imperial throne. It gave them a power base, primarily Austria, and they never let it go.
And from that base in Austria, they just kept expanding. By the time we get to the 16th century, you look at a map of Europe, and it's basically all Habsburg property. Spain, the Netherlands, huge chunks of Italy, not to mention the entire New World.
It truly was the empire on which the sun never set. But that immense power created a brand new psychological problem for them: paranoia.
The mo money, mo problems effect on a geopolitical scale.
Exactly. When you own half the world, you become absolutely terrified that someone is going to take it away from you. And under the feudal system, land changed hands through marriage. If your daughter, a Habsburg princess, married a French prince, that French prince might suddenly have a legal claim on a piece of your territory.
So the solution is, don't let anyone new into the club.
That's it. They developed this strategy called ocularization, literally closing the circle. If you marry your cousin, the land stays in the family. The dowry stays in the family. The titles, the armies, the tax revenues, it all stays within the Habsburg corporate structure. It seemed like the perfect legal and financial defense strategy.
Okay, but this is where I get stuck. The church. We're in the 15th, 16th centuries. The Catholic Church is the supreme moral and political authority in Catholic Europe. And as we said at the start, incest was a massive taboo. How did the church just let this happen?
This is where politics completely trumps theology. And you're right, early Christianity was incredibly strict about incest. They had a really wide definition of it. It wasn't just blood relatives. If you were godparents to the same child, you were considered spiritual kin and couldn't get married.
And the church used those roles as a weapon against other kings, right? I'm thinking of Henry VIII.
Constantly. The Pope could grant or deny an annulment based on these rules of kinship. It was a huge tool of political control. If a king stepped out of line, suddenly the Pope might discover that his marriage was invalid because his wife was his fourth cousin once removed.
Right. So why do the Habsburgs get a pass? Why does the Pope look at a Habsburg uncle planning to marry his own niece and say, yeah, sure, go ahead?
Because by the 1500s, the Habsburgs had essentially achieved regulatory capture of the papacy. You have to remember what else is happening. The Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther is tearing the church in half, the Pope is terrified, he needs a champion, he needs a military superpower to fight the Protestants and protect Catholicism.
And the Habsburgs are that superpower.
They are the defenders of the faith. So a deal was struck, implicitly and explicitly. We will fight your wars against the Protestants, the Habsburgs said, and you will sign off on our marriage licenses.
So it was a straight-up transaction.
Completely. The Pope would issue what were called papal dispensations. These were official legal documents from the Vatican that said, in essence, yes, the laws of God and the Church forbid this marriage, but for this specific case, the Pope is granting an exception. It was sanctified incest.
That is just wild. The one institution that's supposed to prevent sin is literally signing off on it for political convenience. It just shows that the rules were for the little people. The elite got exceptions.
And that hypocrisy shielded them from any social or religious criticism. But it couldn't shield them from biology. Biology doesn't care about a piece of paper from the Pope. Biology has its own rules, and they are unbreakable. And this, I think, is where we start to see the first cracks appear in the armor. We need to talk about Juana.
Juana of Castile. History knows her by a much crueler name. Juana la Loca. Juana the Mad.
Yes, and her story is really the first major flashing red warning siren that the Habsburg family completely and utterly ignored.
Okay, set the scene for us. Who is Juana in this massive family web?
So it's 1496. Juana is a Spanish princess. Her parents are the very famous Ferdinand and Isabella, the ones who funded Christopher Columbus, and they themselves were second cousins, so the gene pool is already shrinking. Juana is married off to Philip the Handsome, a Habsburg. This is the marriage that unites the Spanish and Austrian domains. It's the merger of the century.
And was it a happy marriage?
For Juana, it was obsessive. For Philip, not so much. Philip was a classic political animal. He was a cad. He wanted the power and the title that came with marrying the heir to Spain, but he wasn't particularly interested in his wife. But Juana, she fell deeply, pathologically in love with him.
When you say pathologically, what does that look like?
It went way beyond normal affection. It was a mania. She was incredibly jealous, incredibly possessive. There's a famous incident at court where she suspected one of the ladies in waiting of having an affair with Philip. Juana didn't just scold her. She physically attacked the woman with a pair of scissors and hacked off her hair, disfiguring her in front of the entire court.
Yikes. Okay, that's intense. But Philip didn't actually live that long, did he?
No, he died very young, probably from smallpox or typhoid fever. And at that moment, Juana's instability just completely shattered. She refused to accept that he was dead. She wouldn't allow the priests to bury
She
him.
kept the
She
body.
kept the body. She had him embalmed, supposedly in honey, to preserve him. And then she began this grotesque, macabre journey across Spain with his coffin. She would travel only at night by torchlight.
What? Why?
And she would stop in towns, open the coffin, and have conversations with his corpse. She would embrace him, kiss his feet. And this part is so telling. She was still so jealous, even of his corpse, that she forbade any women from coming near the coffin. Not even nuns were allowed to approach because she was afraid her dead husband would be tempted to cheat on her.
That is a Gothic nightmare. It's essentially a necrophilia road trip across Spain.
It's absolutely horrifying. And eventually her father and later her son, Charles V, had to step in. They couldn't have this spectacle going on. So they had her confined to a convent where she was effectively imprisoned for the rest of her life, locked away and forgotten.
Now, you would think, if you're a family member watching this happen, watching your relative travel the countryside with a corpse, you would think, you might say, hey, maybe there's something not quite right here. Maybe our blood is getting a little too thick. Maybe we should, marry someone from outside the immediate family tree.
You would think. Expert analysis of her symptoms today suggests she likely suffered from severe depression, psychosis, or perhaps a schizoaffective disorder, all of which can have a strong genetic component. This was the first clear, undeniable sign of profound mental and psychological fragility breeding into the family line.
But they didn't see it that way.
No. They saw it as a personal failing of Juana, a female hysteria. They didn't see it as a genetic warning because the political strategy, the strategy of keeping the Spanish land, was just too profitable to abandon.
And the man who made that decision, the man who looked at his mother's madness and decided to double down, was her son, Charles V.
Charles V, an absolute titan of history. He ruled an empire that stretched from the Americas to Austria. He was fighting wars on 3 continents. Some modern historians even call him the father of Europe because he held so much of it together under one ruler.
But while his empire was at its peak, his body was already showing the signs. It was already paying the genetic price.
Yes. This is where we start to see the physical traits become really pronounced, the famous Habsburg jaw.
Talk about the jaw. What was it exactly?
Medically, it's called mandibular prognathism. Essentially, the lower jaw grows disproportionately faster and larger than the upper jaw. In Charles V, it was severe. His lower jaw jutted out so far that his top and bottom teeth didn't meet.
So he couldn't chew.
Not properly. He basically had to swallow his food in chunks, which gave him terrible, lifelong indigestion and stomach problems. And he couldn't fully close his mouth. It was always slightly agape.
There's that brutal story about the peasant, isn't there?
It's a fantastic, if cruel, anecdote. Charles was on a tour of the Spanish countryside, and a local peasant, seeing him ride by, apparently shouted out, "Your Majesty, close your mouth! The flies in this country are very insolent."
Oh, man. The guts on that guy. But it shows you how obvious and shocking his deformity must have been. It wasn't something he could hide.
Not at all. And yet, this is the guy, the man who can't close his mouth properly, whose own mother went mad and had to be locked away. He looks at the situation and decides, you know what our family needs? More of this.
He doubled down.
He more than doubled down. He made it the rule. He saw his sprawling, unwieldy empire, and he became convinced that the only way to hold it all together was more intermarriage. He married his own first cousin, Isabella of Portugal, and then he ordered his children to marry their cousins. He codified the incest. He turned a risky strategy into official family policy.
He essentially doomed his own descendants to save the real estate portfolio.
That is the tragic trade-off he made. He traded humanity for land.
So let's follow that policy down to the next generation, to his son, Philip II of Spain. The focus of the dynasty really shifts to Spain now.
Philip II is a fascinating, dark, and tragic figure. He was incredibly intelligent, a workaholic. They called him the Paper King because he spent all day, every day in his office reading and annotating government reports. But he was also physically marked by the family genes, and his entire life was a desperate, agonizing search for a healthy male heir.
And this is where the Game of Thrones comparison really kicks in for me. The whole story becomes about the struggle for succession. It feels like the universe itself was actively trying to prevent him from having a healthy child.
It's just an unrelenting timeline of tragedy. Philip married 4 times. Let's walk through it. His first wife was his first cousin, Maria Manuela of Portugal. She died at age 17 right after giving birth.
Okay, so a tragic start. But she produced an heir.
She did, a son named Don Carlos, and Don Carlos is one of the saddest figures in this whole story. He was the heir to the entire Spanish Empire, but he was deeply, profoundly unstable.
Unstable like Juana.
Worse, not just eccentric, but actively sadistic. He reportedly enjoyed roasting animals alive. He abused his servants. He threw a page out a window. He also had severe physical deformities. One leg was shorter than the other. He had a hunched back. And eventually, he started actively plotting to overthrow his own father.
So Philip is in this impossible position. His only son and heir is a monster who's trying to kill him. What does he do?
He does the unthinkable. He has his own son arrested and imprisoned.
Yeah.
Philip II had to lock his heir in a tower, where Don Carlos eventually died in captivity, probably from a combination of self-starvation and illness. Imagine the psychological toll of that. You have to jail your own child to save your kingdom.
Unbelievable. So wife #1, dead. The only son from that marriage, also dead. Moving on to wife #2.
Wife #2 is someone our listeners will definitely know. Mary Tudor of England. Bloody Mary.
Oh, wow. The crossover episode of 16th century history.
Exactly. And this was a massive geopolitical play. If they had produced a child, England would have become part of the Habsburg Empire. The entire course of world history would have been different. But they had no children. Mary had a series of phantom pregnancies and died of what was likely ovarian cancer.
So that's strike 2. Wife #3.
Wife #3 was a French princess, Elizabeth of Valois. And by all accounts, this was a genuine love match. Philip absolutely adored her. She was young, she was vibrant, but she only produced daughters. And in the male-dominated inheritance laws of the time, they were desperate for a boy to secure the succession. She died in childbirth trying to provide one.
This is just brutal. It's a conveyor belt of tragedy and death.
It gets to the point of absolute desperation. Philip is getting old. He has no male heir. The entire Spanish branch of the dynasty is staring at extinction. So what does he do?
He goes back to the family playbook.
He goes all in. He marries his niece, Anna of Austria.
His own niece. That's really close.
It's as close as you can get without it being a direct sibling. An uncle-niece marriage. Genetically, it is incredibly risky, but for him, politically, it was the only option left. And in the short term, it worked. She finally produced a viable male heir who survived to adulthood. The future, Philip III.
No, but at what cost?
The cost was staggering. It took 4 wives and 11 pregnancies across those 4 marriages just to produce one sickly male heir. The genetic bottleneck was tightening to a stranglehold. Nature was screaming, "Stop!" And they were just flooring the accelerator.
And all of that, flooring the accelerator, all of that, concentrating the bloodline over and over and over again, it all leads us to the end of the line, the final product, the human result of centuries of this policy. We have to talk about Charles II.
Charles II of Spain, known in Spanish history by the tragic nickname El Hechizado.
Which means?
The Bewitched.
Why, the bewitched.
Because the people of the time, even the most educated doctors, couldn't comprehend what was wrong with him. They didn't know about genetics or recessive alleles. They looked at this poor, broken man, this king who was more like a ghost, and they thought, only witchcraft could explain this. He must be possessed by a demon.
Let's get into the genetic mathematics of it, because you mentioned a stat in the outline that I think explains everything.
This is the scientific smoking gun. If you trace a normal person's family tree back, the numbers expand exponentially. You have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. By the time you get back 5 generations to your great-great-great-grandparents, you should have 32 distinct individuals who all contributed to your DNA.
Right. 32 different ancestors.
Yep.
A diverse genetic portfolio.
Charles II had 10.
Wait, say that again?
10 instead of 32. That means his ancestors were just marrying each other over and over and over again. His family tree wasn't a branching tree. It was a tangled wreath. It just looped back on itself constantly. His father was his mother's uncle. His mother was herself the product of a first-cousin marriage.
So what does that mean scientifically? What does that do to a person's DNA?
It creates what geneticists call long runs of homozygosity. Basically, we all carry a few dangerous recessive genes, bad instructions in our DNA. But usually your dad gives you a bad copy of a gene, but your mom gives you a good working copy and the good one takes over. That's why genetic diversity is so important.
A backup system.
A backup system. But because Charles's parents were so closely related, he got the same broken copy of multiple genes from both sides. He had no backup. His genetic code was full of errors that couldn't be corrected.
I think I read his coefficient of inbreeding was higher than if his parents had been brother and sister.
That's correct. A child of a brother-sister union would have a coefficient of 0.25. Charles II's was calculated to be 0.254. He was, from a biological standpoint, an impossibility, a genetic dead end. He shouldn't have even survived birth.
Paint a picture of him for us. What was his life actually like?
It was a life of pure, unmitigated suffering. Physically, he was incredibly short, weak, and fragile. The Habsburg jaw was so extreme in him that his upper and lower teeth didn't touch at all. He couldn't chew his food. It had to be mashed up for him. His tongue was so large it filled his mouth, so he drooled constantly, and his speech was almost incomprehensible. He suffered from rickets, which bowed his legs, epilepsy, and constant agonizing intestinal problems.
And developmentally, he was also delayed.
Severely. He didn't speak a single word until he was 4 years old. He couldn't walk until he was 8. And because everyone at court, including his own mother, assumed he was going to die any day, no one bothered to educate him. They just let him be. He was the king of the largest empire on earth, and he was basically illiterate. He was apathetic, childlike, and spent most of his days in a daze.
And the medical treatments you mentioned.
Ostracisms.
Horrifying.
Uh-huh.
Because they thought he was bewitched, the court physicians treated him not with medicine, but with religious rituals. They would perform exorcisms, cover his body in the bones of saints, force him to drink holy water. It was essentially torture disguised as healthcare.
But he's the king. He still has to get married. He still has to try and produce an heir to keep the whole thing going.
And so the tragedy continues. They married him off to a beautiful French princess, Marie-Louise d'Orléans. Can you imagine her experience? She's young, she's vibrant. She comes from the glittering, sophisticated court of Versailles under Louis XIV. She arrives in the grim, rigid Spanish court and is married to this drooling, invalid man. It must have been traumatizing.
She was deeply traumatized and fell into a severe depression. The Spanish court hated her because she was French. She died very young, officially of some kind of digestive ailment, but there were widespread rumors that Charles's mother had her poisoned because she failed to get pregnant.
And they tried again after that?
They tried again. They found a German princess, Maria Anna of Neuburg. She was different, much tougher, much more arrogant. But she figured out very quickly that Charles was completely incapable of producing children. He was almost certainly impotent and infertile. So she gave up on him and just started fighting viciously with her mother-in-law over who would inherit the throne when Charles inevitably died childless.
There's that one heartbreaking little anecdote about Charles and his second wife.
Yes, it says everything. He basically ignored her existence. While she and his mother were screaming at each other about politics and inheritance, Charles would just sit in the corner, ignoring the entire court, and eat cakes. He loved sweets. It's just such a pathetic, pitiable image. The king of the world ignoring his crumbling empire to eat a pastry.
And crumble it did. When he finally died, that was the end of the line.
He died in 1700 at the age of 38. And honestly, it's a medical miracle he lived that long. But the autopsy report, it reads like something from a horror novel. The physician who performed it wrote that the king's body contained a heart the size of a peppercorn, corroded lungs, intestines rotten and gangrenous, a single testicle black as coal, and his head full of water.
A heart the size of a peppercorn. Is that literal or a metaphor?
It likely means severe atrophy. His organs had never properly developed. His body just rotted from the inside out while he was still alive. It was total systemic failure. The genetic debt accumulated over centuries had finally come due in one catastrophic payment.
And because he died with no heir, all hell broke loose.
The War of the Spanish Succession, it was effectively World War Zero. All of Europe exploded into a massive war to decide who would get to take over the vast Spanish Empire. France fought against Austria, England, the Dutch Republic. It lasted for over a decade. Millions died. And at the end of it all, the Habsburgs lost Spain forever. The French Bourbon dynasty took the Spanish throne.
So the very strategy they used for 300 years to keep the land intermarriage was the exact thing that guaranteed they would lose the land in the end.
That is the ultimate perfect irony of the whole story. They wanted to keep it all in the family, and in doing so, they destroyed the family.
Now, the Austrian branch of the family, they lasted a bit longer, didn't they?
A little bit longer, but their male line also died out in 1740. The famous Empress Maria Theresa was the last of the direct line. She had to marry the Duke of Lorraine, and so the dynasty had to rebrand itself as Habsburg-Lorraine to continue. But the pure, unbroken male line of the Habsburgs was gone, extinguished by their own marriage policy.
It's just fascinating to think about how this legacy still sort of echoes today. You mentioned that this isn't just ancient history.
No, not at all. That Rutgers study we started with pointed out that even today, globally, about 10% of all marriages are between cousins. But in the specific context of royalty, this inbreeding echoed right up to the First World War. You just have to look at a photograph of King George V of England and his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia.
They look like twins. It's uncanny.
They could be identical twins, because by that point, the royal houses of Europe were essentially one giant, intermarried, inbred family, and it had real consequences. Look at hemophilia in the Russian royal family. That royal disease was passed down from Queen Victoria and spread through these cousin marriages. This sickly Tsarevich, Alexei, destabilized the entire Russian monarchy. Just like the sickly Charles II destabilized Spain, it was a contributing factor to the Russian Revolution.
It really changes how you look at all those grand oil paintings in museums. You stop seeing the velvet and the crowns and the power.
Yeah.
You start seeing the genetic tragedy hiding behind their eyes.
You see the cost. The Habsburgs wanted to be more than human. They wanted to be above the laws of nature. But biology is the one law you can never, ever break. They sacrificed their own humanity, their health, their children's sanity, all for the sake of land. And in the end, the land was still there, but they were gone.
And that's a powerful place to leave it. Next time you look at history, do you see the great kings and their empires? Or do you now see the biological trap hiding behind the crowns? Something to think about.
Absolutely.
This has been The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you on the next one.